Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second lesson of our Age of Empires unit. Today we're going to talk about population growth, the causes for it, and the consequences of it. All right, so let's go ahead and get started right away. So first off, you're going to see this bar graph of world population during this time period. And so notice how much it increases over the entirety of this time, right? So in fact, it's going to, if we look at just the red bars, right? So from 1000 BCE to the year 1 CE, we're going to see the population more than double, right? So it goes from 120 million people to 250 million. And so it's important to note that the rate of growth is going to accelerate vastly during the last 1,000 years of this time period in comparison to like the first 1,000 years. And so if you look at those blue bars there, 1,000 years passes, but there's not a doubling of population, right? So that's unique towards the end. And so, in fact, if we take a look at the year 3000 BCE, that first blue bar, until the first red bar, 1000 BCE, right? It took about 1,600 years for world population to double during that time. And at the end here, 1000 BCE to 1 CE, doubling time was less than 1,000 years. And so not only do we see, as I had mentioned before, an increase in population, we see an increase in the rate at which that population grows. And so this is something that we see throughout all of history. And so once we make the switch to farming, right, so the population is going to continue to increase, but it's going to increase faster than it ever had before. And now once we kind of shift into these empires, population is going to increase faster than it ever had before. And as we march forward in time, that's going to be the case. And if you take a moment, pause this video, Google real quickly, world population doubling time. It's going to blow your mind how little amount of time it takes for our current world population to double. All right, so if we rewind back to the Age of Empires, what's going on that makes population suddenly surge? Well, let's take a closer look. And so here are the causes. The first cause I want to talk about is the invention of iron. And so it's important to note this is in Afro-Eurasia, not the Americas, right? The Americas don't have, they're not producing iron at this point, right? Whereas in Europe, Asia, they have done that. And so they're going to use their newfound capabilities of producing iron to create tools that really help with the making farming way more efficient. And so they're going to create tools like iron axes, hoes, spades, and plows. And this allows them to, as I said, make farming way more efficient. And when they're more efficient, they can grow more food for more people. And when more people eat, more people can exist. All right, another reason that we see the expansion of population is because we see the expansion of both farming and pastoral nomadism. So if you think back to our last unit, when we had talked about kind of the agricultural revolution and how that spurned civilization, right? So we moved from hunting and gathering to a farming way of life. That trend is going to continue into the Age of Empires. And so at this point in time, there's still a lot of people that are foragers, that are hunting and gathering, but there's less of them. And they're shifting towards that farming or pastoral nomadism. And so we know that once people take on that way of living, their populations expand. And that's going to continue to do so here. Another reason that we see, or another cause rather, of population increase is better crops. And so over time, we get better at farming, we use selective breeding, create hybrid crops, et cetera, and so now we just have food or crops that yield more food. Yay! More food means more people. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the utilization of animals like horses and camels to make our farms more productive. And so these are what we refer to as beasts of burden. And again, this is important to note that this is in Afro-Eurasia. horses and camels do not exist in the Americas yet. Okay, so they're not going to exist in the Americas until we bring those types of animals. Europeans bring those type of animals over later on in world history. So, but in Afro-Eurasia, these animals are now being utilized in a farm setting, and we can grow more food. And with more food comes more people. And finally, this is not about farming, but about kind of the rise of city living. And so at this time, more people are still living kind of the countryside, but cities and urbanization is going to become more of a thing. And so population in general is going to become more dense, right? So more people are living in a smaller area. And when you live like in close proximity to other people, you spread stuff. And so over time, though, you build up herd immunity to diseases that have been in your area for a while. And that's what's going to happen here. So instead of kind of passing things along that are new to a group of people and wiping them out, they've all kind of built up this immunity. And when you have immunity, then your population can increase. It's going to backfire, though, when, along trade routes come diseases from far off places and you've never come in contact with them, you meaning the population there, and suddenly you're dropping like flies because you have no defense against this foreign disease. Okay, so that's the causes, right? We talked about the invention of iron. We talked about an increase in farming and pastoral nomadism, way of life, as opposed to hunting and gathering. We talked about better crops. We talked about work animals. And then we talked about building up immunities to local infectious diseases because of our dense population. So let's talk about the consequences of population growth. When we think of consequences, we usually go negative, right? The consequences of not studying for your test is that you get a bad grade. The consequence of not cleaning your room is that your mom's mad at you and she grounds you. But that's, even though we have this negative connotation to consequences, it can be good or bad. So if I clean my room, my mom's happy with me. She gives me $5. If I don't know if anyone would actually do that, but regardless, right? If I study for my test, I get a good grade, right? So consequences can go either way. So let's talk about some consequences. The first one is in fact negative though. So we're going to talk about deforestation. And so as population increases, we need to clear more land for a number of reasons, right? So there's more people, we might need more housing. So we need to clear a section of that forest and build some more infrastructure, right? Houses, roads, canals, whatever it might be. With more people, we need to grow more food. So we've got to clear out another section of forest to raise livestock or grow crops. And so with more people, we need more fuel. What's a great fuel? Wood. So we got to clear out a whole bunch of trees so that we can burn them or use them as building material or whatever it might be. And so there's a lot of reasons why we would clear cut a forest. But the consequence of that, like you run out of fuel, right? You degrade your soil. And so with soil erosion, the good stuff goes away. You're left with soil that's not so great. You can't grow as much food. Perhaps that leads to a famine, or at least food shortages in some capacity. And then there's also the kind of environmental impact of like some plant and animal species will no longer exist. They will go extinct. So deforestation is a big piece there. Another element to the consequences is that complex societies, which we talked about in our last unit, the rise of civilization, they suddenly become more complex, right? So the empires that are going to take hold during this time period are massive on scale. And next lesson, we'll talk about just how big they are in comparison to the United States. But just know they're big. And in order to rule over such vast territory, you've got to have a relatively complex society. So the smaller our society, the less complex everything needs to be. But once it gets really big, the political, social, and economic systems that have to exist in order to make that work are very complex. Another consequence, collective learning will increase. And we talked about collective learning last time, right? Where you take information from the past and then you build upon it. And then you hand it off to the next generation and they build upon that and they build upon that, right? So we couldn't have landed men on the moon if at some point somebody didn't invent the wheel, right? So things build off from each other. And that's going to continue to happen. And there are certain developments that we'll talk about a little bit later that are going to occur that enables collective learning to increase faster than ever before. We talked about urbanization with infectious diseases, but this is a consequence of having more people. So more people living in a smaller area means a denser population. Notice that this graph is showing the number of large cities during this time period, and that there's a drastic fall off at the end. And so we'll talk about that as we move on in time, but just know that the number of large cities usually follows the path of the rise and fall of empires. Okay, and so in conclusion, just to recap, we talked about consequences being the deforestation, and all the elements go along with that. Needing more complex societies than ever before. The idea of collective learning increasing beyond what it's ever been. And then also the idea of urbanization, the number of cities increasing, is going to happen as well. So that's our mini lesson or lecture over population growth, causes, and consequences. And so we have a series of activities that we'll do in class that kind of support this. So anyways, thanks for listening, guys.